Welcome to History Deconstructed. I'm your host, James A. Bear. This is Episode 1, Understanding the Nullification Crisis. The American Civil War was the climax to decades of a dysfunctional dynamic between the federal government and her states, final proof of how much the country had both changed and resisted change since the days of the founders. The war would kill as many as 800,000 and leave vast swaths of the country in ruin, a ruin in which the United States has yet to fully recover. Small wonder that Americans are still debating the exact causes of the war to this day. While it appears that the road to war escalated quickly throughout the 1850s, the truth remains that the problems of the United States date back, but in previous times there was always room for compromise. Compromise had kept the nation from tearing itself apart, attempting to solve its woes. But in attempting to make everyone happy, the efforts would eventually leave no one happy. But even as the country fell apart after the election of 1860, compromisers were still out there trying to piece together a solution. After all, it was not the first time compromise had veered the nation away from war. It had happened before, some 30 years previous, during the Nullification Crisis. In American history, the Nullification Crisis is a mysterious, oversimplified chapter that is quickly mentioned, but it should serve as both a clue to the true causes of the Civil War and a cautionary tale in monetary policy and economics. The Nullification Crisis, put simply, was centered around the state of South Carolina and her complaints over protective tariffs passed by the federal government, then under the administration of the popular war hero, Andrew Jackson. The situation deteriorated into calls for secession, and the state elected to nullify or cancel any part of the tariffs. Jackson threatened to invade the state, but cooler heads prevailed and war was averted. The story of the Nullification Crisis starts and ends with tariffs, but we need to go back further to gain a sense of what was going on. We need to go back to the end of the War of 1812 in the person of South Carolina Congressman John C. Calhoun. The year is 1815, and the United States is in a wave of euphoria. The American nation had survived another war with Britain and asserted herself as a staying power on the world stage. The Republican experiment would not be snuffed out. Americans were in a good mood. Trade, after years of global war, could now resume, and economic investment flourished at home. Calhoun was a patriot and a supporter of the war, but he was under no illusions about the nation's performance during the conflict. The United States survived the war, but she did not win. The U.S. Army and Navy were too small and inexperienced to be effective. The real fighting force were state militias that gave mixed results at best, and the threat of renewed hostilities still did loom in the air, so a fix was needed. Calhoun believed that the key to the next war was an expandable army that trained a surplus of officers. These officers during wartime could quickly train and then lead recruited volunteers. Calhoun joined other politicians in the so-called American system that wanted infrastructural investments like roads and canals that would bind the nation together, and it would make it easier for an army on the march. But in an era before an income tax, the best way to pay for this was with the protective tariff. It is at this point that we have to talk about tariffs. Early Americans are romanticized as pioneers and independent farming types, but in truth, trade was vital since colonial times. The North had long been a center of shipbuilding, lumber, and the fur trade. From Europe, particularly Britain and her possessions, came sugar, tea, and most importantly, from what we'll be talking about, machine tools. Because of its warmer climate, the South was already an agricultural powerhouse. But the money was best in labor-intensive cash crops like tobacco, rice, and ever more increasingly, cotton. For their part, finished goods were in demand, particularly British textiles. This is all well and good, except both regions were changing. just as the South was starting to focus increasingly on cotton in the 18-teens and 1820s, the textile industry in the North was gaining steam. But in sheer scale and price, British textiles were cheaper. They had the industrial capacity. Never mind that the northern states were closer to the cotton. The obvious tool in the toolbox to combat cheap imports is the tariff, a tax on imported goods. If we compare two identical coats, an American-made coat and a British-made coat, since the American industry is just starting out with tooling and investments and such, the American coat is going to be more expensive at $25. But the British imported coat is coming in at $15. Hypothetically, if we impose a duty of $15, that makes the British unit more expensive, so the customer will end up buying American. In theory, this gives the American industry a chance to compete and grow, but ultimately it is the consumer and the business that lose. You are still paying for that coat, more so than you would have otherwise. And if the tariff is imposed, the exporter might retaliate by purchasing fewer goods from you. But we have to keep in mind that these tariffs, at least initially, were designed not just to protect American industry, but to fund Calhoun's pet projects. The tariff of 1816 was passed without fanfare or uproar. It was a temporary measure meant to shore up the country's finances in the event of a continued war with Britain. But the war never came, and the good times rolled on, especially in South Carolina. War fears subsided, and the planter class was expanding, and customers were more than willing to invest. And it was done in a way not dissimilar to how the creation of wealth happens today. The consumer, who does not wish to directly invest but save, puts his money in the bank for safekeeping. To make money for themselves and their customers, the bank lends out that money to the businessman, and in South Carolina, that is the planter. The insecure nature of farming, the need for new land and tool investments, is often balanced on credit. That is no different now than it was then. The planter in South Carolina turns around and buys more land, more tools, and more slaves. This, in theory, will net him a profit, while the interest on the loan enriches the consumer and the bank. In a perfect world, this could go on indefinitely, until it doesn't. The sudden bankruptcy of a northern manufacturing firm triggers the Panic of 1819, the first real economic contraction in the nation's history. The causes of the panic are many, but the effects hurt South Carolina particularly bad. In uncertain times, the consumer withdraws their savings, but now they're withdrawing it at such a rate that the banks cannot keep up. The money coming in from the planters' fields isn't outweighing what is being withdrawn. Banks fail, and those that don't are hammering the planter for their money. The problem is that the planter had mortgaged himself to the hilt to pay for an increased supply of cotton, with no real increase in the demand for that cotton. But now they have to pay up. Land prices fall and farms went abandoned as planters desperately attempted to liquidate their assets to pay off their debts. The nation recovered quickly though, but the contraction left South Carolina in a precarious position. It appears that those planters who still remained in business chose not to downsize, but they wanted to save face, so they doubled down. Every year from 1820 to 1827, cotton production, represented in blue, soared to unprecedented levels. But the amount of money the crop would fetch, represented in orange, barely moved at all. Cotton production did not equal an equivalent amount of money. It seemed that the planters did not understand basic economics. The market was so flooded with cotton, it was not fetching the price that it otherwise would. Cotton was being produced, but nobody was buying it. It is this planter economy, doubling down over debt spending, that the tariffs of the 1820s and the 1830s found South Carolina. You can see two distinct crashes in the graph in 1824 and 1828, the years in which the tariffs were increased on cotton. These tariffs did not start South Carolina's financial crisis, but they certainly helped to prolong it. And as the 1820s rolled on, the tariffs got more punitive in outlook. The Baldwin tariff, passed in the depths of the panic in 1820, was a modest increase that put duties on cotton at 33%. The game changer here, though, is that the rates were meant to be permanent. The southern states were outvoted on the matter, but they might have recovered if it had not been for the continued doubling down on the federal level with even more tariffs. The tariff of 1824 was another modest increase. The tariff of 1828 followed, commonly known as the Tariff of Abominations. It raised cotton duties to an unprecedented 45%, making it the harshest tariff in American history. This set South Carolina off big time, especially now that her leading men were in higher and higher places, particularly John C. Calhoun. He served as Secretary of War under the Monroe administration and made the leap to vice president under his fellow tariffer ally, John Quincy Adams. And he continued to support those tariffs. But it seemed that the Tariff of Abominations was indeed a step too far, even for him, and the economic suffering of his own home state began to bend him. Calhoun made the unprecedented leap of vice president under Adams to vice president under the administration of his old political ally, Andrew Jackson, after the election of 1828. Jackson was less ardent of a supporter of the American system than Adams, but the war hero was popular in both the North and the South. However, there was no immediate effort to reduce the tariff. South Carolina chafed under the pressure, and Calhoun changed his tune, becoming the face of the anti-tariffers. South Carolina Governor John Taylor favored leaving the Union that the state had voluntarily joined, while others, including leading men like George McDuffie, favored a trade embargo with other states to punish the federal government. In any case, the tariffs at this time were seen as a punishment to South Carolina and the South, and the North being the beneficiary of that suffering. South Carolina's government set about gaining support to oppose the tariff policy, particularly from neighboring Alabama and Georgia. For the tariff issue was one edge of the sword South Carolina was worried about. The other edge was the ramping up of this punishment upon the South at a time when the system that supported her economy was coming under increasing attack, the system of slave labor. Opposition to slavery in the United States always existed, but in the first decades of the 19th century, the abolitionist movement in the North was gaining more steam. The issue of slavery raised moral, economic, and racial questions that had no easy answer. Opposition to the practice, as the country continued to expand, forced Congress to address the issue in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The compromise was meant to deal with the fate of the Western territories that had yet to become states. Missouri was petitioning for statehood, and the question of whether to admit her as a free state or a slave state inflamed both sides. Why? It is all about the U.S. Senate. Every state sends 2 senators to Washington, D.C. A new slave state might expand slavery legally. A new free state would mean slavery could be abolished by a Senate majority vote, so the balance between slave and free states needed to be kept. Missouri would ultimately come in as a slave state, but Maine would be brought in as a free state. But the kicker of this compromise was that slavery was prohibited from the territories further north than Missouri's southern border. It was the first real limit to the institution of slavery, and one that in the future would ultimately upset that balance of power. This was far from South Carolina's borders, but the timer was set on slavery in a society that heavily depended on it. It tore the veil of strength from South Carolina. Not only was she heavily dependent on it, but in the 1820s, as the years rolled by, fear of slave revolts grew. So further attempts to hurt cotton only made things worse. Perhaps the only thing keeping the country together was the relationship between John C. Calhoun and his ally, President Jackson. Both were slave owners, both believed in states' rights and the common man. But the punishment of South Carolina drove the two men apart. Talk of secession in South Carolina angered Jackson, a man who spent his life fighting for a United States. But by the election of 1832, Jackson had to know that he was dealing with more than just South Carolina. The tariffs hurt business in other cotton states, and South Carolina was actively seeking their support, should they leave the Union. These states were growing increasingly impatient over the tariffs, and the issue of Indian removal, the deportation of the remaining Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River to the west. Jackson had campaigned on Indian removal, and it was a hot-button issue in the election of 1832. It was an issue of states' rights and national security, since the Native Americans wouldn't be so happy about having their land taken off them. The southern states wanted the natives off the land, but facilitating it in reality was more complicated. There were not enough federal troops to do the job, so the task largely fell to militias. The idea of sending northern militias in to do the job, a job which they may not want to do in this obvious land grab, might incite a shooting war with the Southerners. The Southerners would ultimately be the ones who would benefit from ejecting the natives. Jackson ultimately acquiesced to Southern demands. He even recommended a lowered tariff in the form of the tariff of 1832 to further calm the situation, and it seemed to have done so. But South Carolina would not be talked down. The pressure was too much for Calhoun, though. He resigned as vice president, and shortly after Jackson won re-election in November 1832, Governor Hamilton announced the nullification of the Tariff of Abominations and the Tariff of 1832. He had also called for the legislature to raise 12,000 men to defend Charleston from federal troops. At this point, neither side could back down. Jackson was threatening to invade the state, and South Carolina was willing to shoot its way out of the Union. Jackson could not simply give in to South Carolina's tactics, though, as the secessionists would simply do it all over again later. South Carolina's politicians had to save face. The reduction of the tariff and the freeing up of land with Indian removal had left the rest of the South content, and South Carolina was coming off as unreasonable. But now they were at this precipice. Backing down was weakness. Weakness here would mean continued tariffs and continued attacks on the system of slavery. The standoff continued until March 1833, when Congress, at the behest of Henry Clay, passed the Force Bill, giving Jackson the authority to use military force in South Carolina, but on the flip side, on the very same day, lowered the tariffs further and created a new rate schedule. This use of both the carrot and the stick was enough for both sides to back down and claim a victory. The hypothetical Civil War of 1833 was averted. And with a glance back at our cotton index, suggests that South Carolina was staging a recovery. In 1836, the gap between the crop and the price had narrowed, but the crop was ever higher. This shows us the true lessons of the Nullification Crisis ultimately went unheeded. The doubling down on cotton and the slave labor to produce it would continue, even though the crisis should have taught them about diversification and the vulnerability of the system to interstate and international politics, never mind the inefficiency of it all. Fast forward to 1860. The state's drug-like addiction is still there. Any money spent on manufacturing was less money invested in making a killing off of cotton. The situation in the other southern states was just as dire. In 1833, the South was a somewhat smaller playing field, with fewer states, and those states that did exist were relatively new and underdeveloped. This might have been an indicator as to why the rest of the Deep South did not threaten to follow South Carolina's lead along with Jackson's tactics. In 1860, all that had changed. Several more states were admitted, and they were all dominated by cotton. So when South Carolina left the Union, 11 other slave states went with her, and it took the bloodiest war in American history to bring them back.